Hi there everyone, Foxy Fern here, and welcome back to Animating a Squirrel in Maya. So this video is going to be a little different for a few reasons. One being, I did actually have a lot of struggles with the figuring out how to make the tail do what I wanted it to do. And for another reason, when I was doing that screen recording, it has been a long time since I actually recorded the previous video. As you can tell, my hair is a little bit longer. And I used the wrong recording software. So unfortunately, my graph editor did not show up on the time-lapse video. And I feel like the graph editor is one of the most important things about my animation process. And so I didn't think it was as valuable of footage. So instead, what I'm going to do is just kind of walk you through a few things that I did in order to get to this point. So first of all, I will just show you what our animation turned out like. Although if you watched the intro to this series, you've already seen that, but here you go anyway. So as you can probably figure out from this, the tail isn't really moving the way that the squirrel was moving in the video reference that I had mentioned in the previous video. And as it turns out, I ended up not actually utilizing reference for this because the tail, the way the rig is set up has some limitations, and I don't have 100% manual control over the tail like I would prefer, but I didn't want to get into breaking down the rig apart and changing it up, especially if you guys are going to download this rig and try to toy around with it, then, you know, my advice for the tail wouldn't really apply because you would be stuck using what the default rig is instead of what I did. So instead, I kind of took some elements from that video. Like you can see here where the squirrel does this little flick, and then when he uses his tail to kind of start pushing himself forward again, I kind of adapted that from the video reference because like a squirrel in real life does do that little tail flick motion. They probably do a lot more flicks than this. And then outside of that, I just kind of put in some overlapping motion that's like not necessarily squirrel-like, but I thought it looked at least appealing enough for this character. I mean, he's not a realistic squirrel anyway, right? Like this is already extremely cartoony, so I totally think it's okay that you can get away with not actually animating it like a realistic squirrel, but I still wanted to have like some squirrel essence, and I feel like that mostly came across. So to walk you through what I was doing here, I was struggling a lot in the beginning of trying to animate this tail with getting this tail to do the motions that I wanted it to, because as you can see here, and that I kind of explained this in the last video, but when I rotate one control, the controls below it are rotating in a weird way. You can see just this one below it is kind of over rotating, but the one below this one is staying in the place of where it is now. Like if you look at these two in relation to each other, and you look at these two in relation to each other, when I rotate this control is now gaining on that one, but these two controls are staying relative to each other. So that's extra weird to me. I kind of wish that either this one didn't change in relation to the control above it, or they all changed in relation to each other. Like I don't really like that choice either, but so you can understand why, like I would rotate this here and then you get this weird shape. And so I would have to like also rotate that, but then you also get this weird shape, and then yeah, it was a bit of a struggle. So what I was trying to do was I started animating from the base tail control first, and I was just animating an X because I just wanted this motion to look good, since like we are animating to a camera and it's mostly a side view. So the X rotation was the most important rotation to get looking right. But then, to add some like organic feel to it, then eventually you want to animate on the other rotation axes too, which I was intending on doing after I got the X-axis looking good. But what actually ended up happening after a few hours of fighting with this thing is I was just kind of fed up, and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to screw around, and I'm just going to grab all of these controls and, like, I guess minus these last two, because I didn't really put animation on those because it seemed to affect the tail in a weird way. And I was like, I'm just going to rotate these guys in. Oh, well, now, yeah, okay, so you can see when you're rotating these all at once, it does like some weird things, but you can see, oops, here we go. You can see in here that while it looks weird, it actually kind of adds this strange level of an organic feel to it. And so I then decided that maybe it's actually better if I am intentionally animating in all these axes at the same time. So that's kind of what I did. I had my basic motion, like the little flick thing, I had already animated that in just the X-axis, but definitely by adding some Y and Z rotation to these controls, it really kind of brought it to life. So you can see from the back view, his tail does kind of like flail about a bit at first, which I was actually okay with because I kind of had the idea that he's jumping down from a very tall area there when he comes on the screen. And then you can see it just sort of has this nice little like settle. Like he's kind of frozen, so to speak, but nobody is ever completely frozen unless that's specifically an effect that you're going for. You could play around with that, but that's not what I was trying to do with this. And then as he flicks his tail again, it starts moving in the other axes. And then as he hops away, it just kind of swings back and forth like this. And I think that really ultimately ended up looking okay. But what's really strange about this is this tail animation all came together literally within the last 20 minutes that I worked on this animation. I spent hours fighting with this thing, and finally I just screwed around unintentionally and actually discovered that there was an easier way to do this. And that kind of gives me a good opportunity to talk to you about what you can do in like a professional setting where you are fighting with a rig, but you can't actually change the rig. So potentially, if you're working at like a fully fledged studio like I'm working at right now, I can talk to our tech artist and work with them on either developing a tool that will help make something easier for me, or changing the rig, maybe placing joints in a different area, or fixing the skinning, or just in some cases like actually changing the way a part of the rig functions. So that would be like my first step if I'm really banging my head against my desk trying to make an animation work because it's like a constant fight with the rig. That would be my first step, is to talk to the person who made the rig and see if we can change something. But that's not always going to be the case for you, especially if you're doing something like this where you're working with a rig that you found online. So what I ended up doing was, for a while, I was just like really trying to fight with it to make it do what I wanted it to do. But at some point, I surrendered to the thought that, like, you know what? Maybe I'm just not going to be able to make this look good the way that I want it to move. If I was doing some 2D animation, basically I could just draw it how I wanted to draw as long as I had the skills to do so, right? But with 3D, you're limited to the rig. So instead what I did, I was like, what is a different approach that I could take with this character. And ultimately what I landed on was like, I wanted to do more of a sort of springy tail because it seemed like this rig would allow me to just make the tail look nice, but kind of make it more like a springy tail rather than what a real squirrel tail would look like. So I toyed around with that a bit, and I was able to make something work a little bit better. So that's one thing you can do if you're struggling with a rig. Maybe you have to change your idea a little bit to make it work. But I think it's better to reevaluate your idea and your process and perhaps change something about it in order to achieve something that looks good that may not have been your original idea, but that original idea wasn't going to come across very well. So that's ultimately what I ended up doing with this animation. And I think it turned out okay. I am pretty happy with this. I guess I don't really have a whole lot more to say about how I went about animating this tail. If you guys have any questions, by all means, please feel free to ask me in the comments below, or I can make another video really going into some more in-depth stuff on like what I was talking about with process changes and making something else work better for your idea than what you intentionally set out to do. One thing I will point out is when I was animating this originally, I was just animating on the x-axis and I was animating on my base layer. And then as I started adding my Z and Y rotations, as you can see on this base layer, all there is X here. And instead what I did was I put all these controls on a layer so that I could just animate the Z and the Y, and I could, move these keys around without having all of my X keys in the way. Because as you can see, this isn't normally what I would have like an overlapping animation look like, because these curves are a little bit janky in comparison to each other because of all like kind of some counter animating stuff I had to do. But I didn't want to mess up the keys that I had here. So instead, I brought everything onto a layer and I animated it there. And like, if you really wanted to, you could just have tail, you could call it tail Z, and then you could have another layer and you could call it tail Y. So if you wanted to have all your rotations on separate layers so you knew exactly what you were looking at, that way you could be in a little more control of that. And so one thing I need to do now this animation is complete, it doesn't matter so much since this is just for the purpose of making a video with it, but if I was in like a game studio setting, I would merge these layers down to make sure that if any other animator opens up this file, they don't get confused by those layers. It's just good practice to not have leftover animation layers in your Maya file once the animation is complete, so to speak. Another tip I have for you when doing something like this motion, I do tend to like to pose out a few keyframes for the motion that I want. So like on my down pose here, I would, like make this tail straighten out because I'm like, oh, he's falling down now. So that would be my straight pose. And then as he's jumping up, this is going to be the compressed pose. So I would probably make poses like that. But then, you're going to have some overlapping animation and they're not all going to be moving at the same time. So then what I would do is I would basically find like a neutral pose like this. And instead of deleting my keys, if I just really wanted to focus on making this one look good and make sure there was nothing weird going on there, what I would do is I'd find a neutral pose and then I'd go over here into my channel box and I would grab these rotation keys and I'll say mute selected. So I had all four of these controls selected, and now I've just muted all those channels. So you can see when I click on this here, those keys are still there, but, well, let's see here. For this example, I'm actually going to go ahead and merge these layers because I didn't have to select that like I did. I'm just spacing out here. So what I would do is I'd grab these and then mute these channels. it was still going to show up with animation on my other layer. That's why I wanted to merge those together. So now when you select these, you can see the keys are still there. They're just grayed out. So that means that like it's going to be muted for now. And now when I play this animation back, the only things animating are going to be the ones above those because I didn't mute it. So it's like, oh yeah, okay, I can see now that my base animation, it looks okay. Like, sure, the tail is stiff, but it looks fine. So then I would grab the key above it. And once I got the animation looking the way I wanted, then I would unmute this one. Wait, did I unmute that? What did I do? I don't know what I just did. Unmute, selected. Oh, weird. Okay, I don't know why the keyframe color changed there, but it seems to be fine. So now I can see, all right, okay, those two controls look pretty good, and it's just the end of the tail that's stiff. And then I just keep going through that process one by one to make sure that everything is looking good. The reason I do that is because a lot of times you can have some like weird, ugly motion that's happening, and it can be hard to like pinpoint exactly where that problem is coming from. So what I like to do is grab all of the controls that could be causing that and basically mute everything and then just start unmuting things one by one. And that seems to be like the easiest way to really figure out like if there's just maybe a thing is rotating the wrong direction, and because I posed it out before going into spline, I actually counter animated the control above it, so it like looks almost okay when everything is being played at the same time, but it's maybe a little janky because I didn't notice like visually that I had actually counter rotated that thing. So that's why I like to use the mute channel feature in that situation. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up this workshop series of animating this bouncy, fun squirrel in Maya. I hope you guys enjoyed this and found something useful from these videos. Please, by all means, give me any and all pieces of feedback. If you loved it, I'd love to hear, so I know to do more things like this. If you hated it, feel free to say so. I only ask that you please tell me why you hated it, because as an animator, I appreciate constructive feedback, and I always want to improve. So if you can enlighten me with something that you didn't like about this, I will take that into consideration for any future videos. Also, if there's anything about any of these videos that you would like me to elaborate more on, maybe like animation layers or the muting the channels thing, you want to have a breakdown process of what exactly I do with that, or talking about overlapping motion, anything at all, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I will gladly make a video talking about these things a little bit more in depth. Like I said in my first video of this series, I didn't want to clutter this up too much. I basically wanted to like kind of do a step-by-step through what my process would be from beginning to end of making an animation like this. So that is going to be it for this first workshop on my new channel. Thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait to figure out what the next animation workshop is going to be and what you guys would like to see. So I am looking forward to making some more videos for you all and sharing my love for animation. Thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll see you next time.